Hi everybody. Yes, we know you can hear us. We're just discussing setting it all up. So thanks for letting us know that you can hear us. So we're going to hand over to Serge Zorino now to run this session. I think George is on. No video yet, but he's on audio at least. So hopefully we'll get video. If not, he'll be appearing by audio only. So I'm going to spotlight the video onto Serge and let you take it away, mate.
Thank you, Luke and Brian. This session is billed from all the lands on earth we come, and the first job, of course, for me is to say that I am living on unceded, colonised lands and waters of the Yaluk Ut Wilam of the Boon Wurrung Nation, and I pay my respects to their sovereignty and the knowledge of elders past, present and emerging, and I learn from them every day. In fact, I learnt from Millie, Thomas and Tila this morning with that session that Bob Boughton moderated, and I will continue to learn about the struggle of our Indigenous and First Nations peoples. I'd just like to take a short break from that and also acknowledge the contribution that was made by one of our comrades who was a long time in the party, Ray Jackson. Ray passed a couple of years ago, but his contribution was just enormous. I had a long friendship.
Yes, now what I've got is a screen with 4 faces on it.
And we were friends for 40 odd years. We've assembled a panel today, George Zangalis, Pierina, Pirisi, Gaetano, Greco and Matt Kunkel. These comrades are, we did originally have Joe Caputo on the panel, but Joe has been taken ill suddenly. So we've asked Gaetano to join us on the panel, and he agreed to participate. We haven't got George on the screen yet, so I'm not sure what's happening there.
You're on.
Hello.
George, we've got you. Thank you very much, George, for joining us.
You've got me now.
Yes, we've got you now.
I'm technical assistant.
I think that we're
time.
Oh, hang on.
George, thank you for joining the panel. And perhaps I should just introduce you straight onto the panel. We were discussing earlier, and today we've been discussing the role that communists have played from the party's inception in the 1920s. And we know that the party was very strong here in the 20s and had many Italian and, in fact, Guido Baracchi was one of the first Italians in Melbourne to be active in the party. I think he was the co-editor of the Proletariat Review. But also there were many Greek communists. And what I'd like to do is to hand it straight over to you. You arrived in Australia as a 19-year-old in February 1950. I think you were working just down the road here at the Fisherman's Bend GMH assembly plant, and you joined the party in the Carlton branch in 1950 in December, so not very long after you arrived. During the 60s, George worked for the party as an organiser here in Victoria, and he represented migrant workers on the Central Committee, as it was then, of the party, and then later the National Committee. George was instrumental in leading the party policy by assisting to develop the first manifesto, I think he calls it, on migrant workers and ethnic minorities at the CPA Congress of the 26th National Congress held in 1979. I was at that Congress, remember it. he was elected as the ACTU's first chair of the ACTU Migrant Workers Committee, a brand new idea at that time for workers to be represented at the highest levels of the trade union movement. And he was also a foundation member of the Ethnic Communities Council here in Victoria, and was active on FECA at the national level, both being official community consultation bodies that were established through and after the multicultural wave that hit us post the Whitlam era. Of course, that was in reaction to the closing of the White Australia policy and the wave of immigration that we had in the 1950s. In more recent times, George has led campaigns using his extensive community and media contacts in leading the apology by government for those unwanted immigrants who were denied citizenship rights. And he continues to fight for a fair go for pensioners and better aged care, particularly for migrants and other working class elderly who don't have the funds to go into private nursing homes. And the nursing homes has been a big issue right around Australia with the COVID pandemic, as we know. So I'll hand it over to you, George. Welcome to the panel. 70 years of activism, George. You'll have to condense that into 5 minutes for us. Can you do it?
Thank you very much. So nice to see so many of you comrades. We've all grown a bit older, and some of us a bit too old. However, on this occasion, we feel much younger. Yes, we did came from all lanes to Australia, but not to a terra nullius. There were people here before us. And you must remember the origins, not only of the party, but of this land. We're all migrants to this continent, with the exception of the Aboriginals. We brought with us the best and the worst of the countries of our origin. Some came here for fortune, others because of political reasons. That was also reflected, if you like, in the makeup and the foundation of our own party. We're aware of the Scots and the Irish. They came together in small numbers to form the party, but it's worthwhile to be reminded among the foundation members of the CPI, there was to be an Italian, a couple of Russian revolutionaries, a few people of Jewish origin, and indeed a multicultural party from day one. It was Australia's greatest and only rebellion, the Eureka Decade, looking back on the southern flank. Workers, diggers, miners from all lands came together to fight for freedom and democratic rights. And they hoisted the Eureka flag. And he was there to write the history, along with Peter Lela, Raffaello Carboni, and this can go on. When I came in the 1950s, and joined the Carlton branch of the CPA, it was made up of several Jewish people from France and Poland, a handful of Italians and Greeks, and Stephen Murray Smith. And then the population of Australia was hardly 8 million in total. And 95% of all those hail from the British Isles. Fast forward, we've seen a massive transformation where almost half of Australia's population derived by birth or origin from many other lands in the British Isles. And given that immigration is a constant component of Australia's growth and will remain so, in order to be mindful that we cannot claim Australia something of our own and put up walls, political, ideological, and physical, to keep others moving in, when the world around us is surrounded by overpopulation and the waters of the Pacific may rise and force the islanders to seek asylum in Australia. We cannot send our boats out there to fight them politically, ideologically, or physically. So we need to learn how to live and make the most of the people we have and prepare for the future ahead. In the Communist Party, we found an organization and help it grow that will take care of our ambitions to see a new society, to see the exploitation of people by people, and the liberation of humankind, along, of course, with the everyday problems of bread and butter and improved cultural and political life. The Communist Party, I said in its ranks from day one, as I said, people of all ethnic backgrounds. But with mass immigration, we saw the tremendous impact that immigration has had on the working class movement, the labor movement in general. We came here without any two basic weapons, if you like, language and trade. And we had to take the lowest paid jobs, the shit jobs, to put it plainly, and that was the intention of mass immigration. So it is today, factory fodder. But we had ambitions and aims, objectives strengthened in the Communist Party that became the collective organization through which we can achieve successes in our struggles to settle for a better life, economic, social, political, but also to maintain culture and language. And migrant communists had to fight on several fronts, one of which, of course, was the everyday struggle for better working conditions, more democratic rights. The other one was to maintain culture and language. When I came here, I was recognized as an alien. I was given a piece of paper, an alien. And I was required to report every 6 months to the police as if I was a criminal. Later on, we were described as NSWs, non-ethnic, non-English background. Later on, we became cults, culturally diverse linguistically, and multiculturalists. In other words, the others, the inferior, if you like. The ones have to come up to the standards of the white Australian policy. So they wanted to keep us on the outside. Through the Communist Party and the connections it had with the labor movement, we were able very quickly to make common cause with many other organizations, to build working class organizations within our own communities, which were not ghettos, desperate people not knowing where to go. These communities were very small, numbers grew into hundreds of thousands and even millions. And they are thriving ethnic minorities. And if the Communist Party in 1936 was successful to be the first party to come up with a statement and campaigns to accompany it for the rights of the indigenous people to be recognized in their own right, and then some 30 or 40 years later, in 1976, it was the Communist Party that came up with a manifesto about the rights of migrant workers and ethnic minorities to have an independent voice of their own in the affairs that affect them in Australia. No other party has ever recognized that in Australia we have ethnic minorities. But our greatest contribution, if you like, is that wherever we went and worked, we kept establishing, parallel to the major organizations, migrant worker committees in workplaces, in unions, in localities. We had two history-making migrant worker conferences and trying to influence the policy of the ACTU and the trade union movement. We have been successful working with progressive teachers in schools to introduce the teaching of ethnic languages in our government schools. We've been successful in the union movement to adopt a policy of teaching migrants English on the job without loss of pay. That became government policy. In a sense, comrades, we fought very hard for the everyday needs for migrant workers, but also for the recognition that Australia is a nation of many ethnicities, that have ethnic minorities, and the class struggle and the struggle for ethnic identity, they're not in opposition to each other, but they are complementary. We also, I forgot to mention, we broke the stranglehold that the media had in Australia, monocultural, monolingual, and we established in the leadership of the movement, ethnic communists and other progressive people in the country to establish the multilingual radio and television broadcasting and to begin to get representatives of ethnic minorities in unions, in municipal councils, and every now and then even in parliament. However, the general feature is that although we're the most multicultural country in the world, those who govern it are still the hardcore of assimilationists of the Anglo-Celtic background. So if there is underrepresentation in a society now, as it always has been, it is not only between sexes, it is also between ethnicities. For comrades, one can go on talking for a long time. I hope I don't have to do that. But on this occasion, to acknowledge that without the Communist Party, it would have been impossible for peoples of minorities to break through and be part of the struggles that are delivered quite a lot, and for which the Communist Party and the communists to be proud for their magnificent contribution, the ultimate aim, of course, being the liberation of humankind. And if it is a birthday today of 100 years, what do we say on birthdays? Many happy returns. And looking back, I would like to say we made a mistake in dissolving the Communist Party historically. But we're here, and others will follow us. And I'm sure the aim of socialism is the one the humanity is striving for. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, George, for those stirring words. And I'll just pick up on one of the things that you mentioned there, which is the teaching of English and the rights that migrant workers now have in their awards about that. I know that that was dear to Pierina's heart because she was active between 1970 and 1984 in both Melbourne and in Sydney, first in Sydney actually. She arrived with her sister Nicolina and her brother Antonio in March of 1970, and she left from the island of Sardinia in Italy, and she arrived at Sydney Airport in April of 1970, unable to work in her chosen profession, which was accountancy. Because of her limited knowledge in English, she, thanks to her uncle and contacts here, was able to gain employment at the Villawood Textwood Company, a lowly paid job in an industry which was overrepresented by migrant women, but she acted to defend migrant women's workers' rights, and she, through regular being a Tribune reader, was attracted to the party and joined the CPA. She's supported by the party and begins to work, she worked with Judy actually, Nundy, at the party office, I think it was in Dixon Street, and as a migrant organiser and translator. And she also got involved with my old union, the Engine Drivers Union, FEDFA, at the Sydney Trades Hall, they were then, and as a researcher. But she, through the 70s, Pierina and other leading CPA activists organised the first Migrant Workers Conference in Sydney, which was in 1973. And she was elected as to the CPA's National Committee in 1974. She was one of the first migrant women to hold such a position in the party at the peak policy-making body or level. Later in the 70s, Pierina joins the Australian branch of the Partito Comunista Italiano, PCI, and was employed by FILEF, the Italian Migrant Workers and their Families organisation, broad community organisation. And she worked particularly as a coordinator. She also worked part-time in home care for the elderly and studied for her university degree. Whilst being a FILEF community organiser, Pierina assisted in liaison between the unions and their members to further migrant workers' rights. Together with comrades like Frank Bollins, me included, we were able to organise the first AMWSU Migrant Workers Rank and File Conference in 1980, one of the first of its kind in Australia. That's reported in Tribune, for those who want to go looking for it, in July of that year. Pierina does a lot of work during these years, helping to research the best ways to provide on-the-job teaching of English to migrants in both Sydney and at BHP in the Port Kembla Steelworks, where many migrants worked. In '81, Pierina and her partner Eduardo moved from Sydney to Melbourne and continued work with publishing of Novo Paese, which was the FILEF newspaper of communication, mass communication means with the Italian community, nationally actually. And she continues in community activist work amongst Italian migrants and their families in Melbourne. In '84, Pierina and Eduardo returned back to Italy, and they decide to settle in Modena, which is near Bologna. Most of us know it as the red centre of Italy. And she still hosts and enjoys visits from past Italo-Australian compagni, many of whom are watching and listening to this broadcast. Over to you, Pierina.
Thank you, Serge. I eventually unmuted myself. Yes, just you hear me well? Can you hear me? Yes. Yes. I should come closer to the computer. I'm just struggling with technology, I'm sorry. Yes, as Serge said, I came to Australia in 1970 from a small village in Sardinia. Although my village was small, the spirit and ideas of 60ites, of the 60ite movement, arrived in my village too. And I share those ideas. Also, I read a book about Karl Marx in my village library. And I said, oh, he's really right. So I'm telling you this, just so that you understand how meeting the CPI was a very important event for me. I was working then at the textile, Villawood textile factory in Villawood, in the western suburbs of Sydney. And I was renting a room with a Yugoslav family in Villawood. And I found Tribune in a newspaper shop in Villawood. And I read the paper and I said, oh, these are my ideas. And So I went to Dixon Street in Sydney and joined the party. Yeah, it was an open door to Australian society for me, turning point actually. And also the party, CPI was happy to have a young migrant woman during the party. I was 22 then. And as Serge said, I worked for the CPI for a short time, and also sometimes for the SBSI. And while I was working for the CPI as a migrant organizer, we organized the first Migrant Workers Conference in Sydney in 1973. And a few migrant and Australian comrades organized it with the involvement of a number of unions and also a number of migrant communities. I don't know if my memory is correct, but I think it was the first time in Australia that there was a public recognition of the fact that the Australian workforce was multicultural and multilingual. And the issues were raised, like proposals made for finding the way to improve communication or to start communication between migrant workers and unions, and not only for the unions to tell migrants what they were doing, but also for unions to know what migrants wanted, what they needed, what their conditions were. And proposals like, so Serge said, teaching English on the job without loss of pay during working hours, and also translating and interpreting services, and also migrant worker centers. The proposal of migrant worker centers to be with bilingual people to help, this two-way communication. And all these proposals were taken up by workers' conferences, which were held in Melbourne, also the ICTU conferences, and also some results were obtained, not as much as maybe we wanted, here and there something was done about migrant workers committees, and but maybe not as as general as we wanted to be, something recognized by all unions and by and set up migrant worker centers which effectively work everywhere, across the workplaces. It was also through the CPI that I met the Italian comrades. It was on the 31st of December 1972, during the big demonstration against the Vietnam War. I went to this demonstration with the Australian comrades, and they introduced me to the Italian comrades. And so eventually I joined the PCI, as Serge said, and she left, and I was more involved in the Italian community. And I think one of the main contributions we made to Australian society, we as migrants, as Italian migrants and other migrant groups, was the idea that migrant cultures cannot be identified with stereotypes, that all cultures are pluralistic and evolve. Workers' councils, the Charter of Workers' Rights, women's liberation, the laws on divorce and abortion were part of Italian culture. So and the interaction among people from different cultural backgrounds could enrich the whole of society and also form the basis for a united and strong workers' movement. And that, I think, it's a lesson that we also have to learn here in Italy today. I say, what was my 5 minutes, right?
Thank you, Pierina. That's your comments there about particularly the relations between the Communist Party here in Australia and the Partito Comunista is really relevant. Maybe one of the few direct contacts that the party had on a daily basis in that period that made direct contact between the two international parties. And we have spoken at this conference during the day of the need for international work, and more so today in the current world circumstances. But I'm sure that the other speakers will come back to that point a little bit later. Our next speaker is Gaetano Greco. Gaetano was active in the party, I think he told me, from his university days, and he formed some left-wing political perspective on the world in the late 70s. He joined the party before joining the FILEF, and when he did join FILEF, I think he met up with Pierina and many of the other comrades that were working in the Melbourne branch of the Partito Comunista Italiano, Australian branch. During the mid-90s, he worked for the Victorian Trades Hall Council as an ethnic affairs officer under John Halfpenny, and he took over from Lorella Di Pietro, and the Victorian Trades Hall Council had a history of supporting ethnic workers' initiatives and supporting the work of coordinating those initiatives here in Victoria, and I'm sure that Gaetano will talk to that. Campaigning later in the local government area, he represented the left, progressive left, and he won a seat in the Darebin Council for his local ward. In 2014, Gaetano was elected the mayor of the Darebin Council, and one of his achievements, amongst many local progressive community achievements, was to unveil a monument to the traditional owners of the Wurundjeri country, which is part of the Darebin Council local government area, in August of 2014. Currently, Gaetano is contesting the 2020 council elections as a progressive independent, and the results have not been announced, but we're all hoping that Gaetano will be re-elected to council. Over to you, Gaetano.
First of all, thank you, everyone. And I'd like to also take the opportunity to thank Serge for roping me in at the last minute to replace Joe Caputo. Also, like to say hello to Pierina and George and Matt and the others. As was mentioned by Serge, I joined the CPA, I think it was in the early 80s, and I used to go there at Exploration Lane, hang about. I think that's where I bought my first Communist Manifesto, and I was already left-leaning, but that really inspired me. And then later on, as Serge said, through the CPA, I got to know about the FILEF, the Federation of Italian Workers and their Families, and also the Italian Communist Party that had a branch here in Australia, and I became very attracted to Gramscian thought and also the workings of the Italian Communist Party. And as Serge said, I also worked for a short stint at the Trades Hall Council as the ethnic liaison officer, and been very active in trade unions in the public sector. What I wanted to do in the few minutes that we have is just to cover off on 3 areas that I think of the CPA's important contribution, and in relation to migrants, but also generally in relation to Australian politics. One of the first areas I think that the CPA was really crucial is that it was a repository of ideas. communists, critical thinkers, all came together, if you like, within the CPA. And there was a sharing of knowledge and experience, and also strategies and also methods of work. And I think that was really important because it gave people from all walks of life, in whatever area that they were involved in, whether in cultural activities, in trade unions, in schools, in other social aspects of life, whether in the women's movement, and like in our case, a lot in the migrant workers movement, an opportunity to actually share ideas and make those links and those networks and work collectively with the broader cross-section of the progressive movement. It was, I think earlier this morning, somebody said that it was like an intellectual organizing hub. And I think that really is an apt description of what we were. And also, I think that as a repository of ideas, it enabled the various progressive ethnic community groups and individuals and organizations to come together or to form links, like the Greek Democracies, a lot of the South American progressive organization, whether it was the Uruguayan Communist Party in Australia or the Chilean Communist Party in Australia. The Turks had very many progressive organizations. So it enabled us to actually come together. And the conduit, I think, many times was also assisted by the CPA. And also, I think, as a repository of ideas, I think the CPA and the unions closely linked to the CPA actually opened up their doors to migrant workers, as Pierina and George mentioned. It was the unions like the metal workers and the construction unions that had a strong CPA presence, a strong communist presence, that actually were the first to open themselves up to migrant workers. The second point I wanted to cover is about migrant workers and migrants and workers issues. And I think it's important, to me, it's been, because I lived through the 80s and the 90s and now in the 2000s. And back then, when we were dealing with migrant issues, because of the presence of communists, progressive peoples, the issues of migrant issues were highly politicized. That is, when we were talking about those issues, we were talking about migrant workers issues. In later years, I think we've slipped. We've gone into the softer type issues of, festivals and activities and cultural activities and things like that. But back in the 80s and 90s, as Pierina and George mentioned, the migrant workers conferences, workers' issues were centered to the whole issue of migrants. And I think that's something that we lack today, unfortunately. I think because of the absence of a party like the Communist Party. And that's why we had issues back then about teaching English on the job, which was so crucial and important. And those sort of issues have sort of lost their way because multiculturalism has become more of a cultural phenomenon. As George mentioned, we're the others, we're the ones that dress up in funny costumes, have occasional festivals, but we're not seen as politicized agents in a society. And we're still treated from the perspective where we just provided services in terms of welfare service or translating services, but not seen as protagonists, as the CPA and progressive elements back then saw us. And Pierina is an example of that, where she occupied a fairly senior position within the CPA. And the last point I wanted to touch on is the issue of institutional racism. And I think this is an important issue, is that because when I look back over the last 30 or 40 years, is that we fought to be seen, as George said, to be recognised. We're here, we're part of a multicultural society. But when I look today at 2020, where are we in the institutions? If you look at the parliament, we're hardly absent. If you look at where the blacks are, where the brown people are, where people from Asian backgrounds, I look at my own council, of which I'm a councillor, and hopefully to get re-elected again. When I look at the senior administration in the council, it's all white. It's all dominant Anglo-Saxon people from an Anglo-Saxon background. So that's where I say about the institutional racism, the structural racism. I think we haven't made enough inroads there, and in terms of having an impact in relation to occupying positions of power and being recognised that we can occupy those positions of power, and where that racism has moved beyond the issue of individual forms of racism or individual events of racism. We have to look at structural racism. And I think there's a lot to learn from the Black Lives Matter phenomena that's come from the United States. They also come here to Australia, also with the Indigenous people, that we have to look at structural issues. And I think that's where a critical left, a communist left, that type of thinking is important in us to understand the structural forces that actually dictate and determine how particularly minority groups, if it's not women or if it's migrants, actually have an impact on our society. Thanks.
Thank you, Gaetano. I really like your current activism and your views on, that we've got a lot of work to do. George and Pierina sort of have laid the foundations of some of the actions that are still going on today. And I suppose the responsibility is now with our younger generation to take up that challenge that you just posed to us. And that's where I think Matt Kunkel would come in here. Matt is a current generation union activist. I think he came from the what we call the old MISOs, combination of the MISOs and the Liquor Trades Union. It was LHMU. He worked looking after lowly paid migrant workers in that industry. He is currently, he worked for Victorian Trades Hall Council as an organiser responsible for industrial and community campaigning. He's currently the director of the Migrant Workers Centre here in Victoria, which is dedicated to advancing the interests of migrant workers who particularly are suffering the effects of fractionalised employment and the types of employment that we've got at the moment, which move against the workers being able to organise easily. Not that we had it easy in our time, but he does. He's also a president of the Search Foundation, so I'll just hand it over to Matt to give us maybe a response, Matt, to the issues that have been raised by George, Pierina and Gaetano.
Thanks, Serge. And can I also start by paying my respects to the elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations whose land I'm dialing in from today, and also recognise that my family's migration story goes a fair way back, further than any of the other panellists today, back to the 1850s, with my German family coming as part of the colonisation project on Jagera land up in Queensland. And to Gaetano's point about institutional racism, I think that I probably should point out, obviously there is a bit of an incongruence there, that someone of such relatively long history in Australia being the head of a migrant workers centre is something that has been pointed out to me before. And my intention one day, very close, is to hand over to those next generation of activists that are coming up through the centre to take over. I really want to just touch on a couple of really quick things and really pay testament to the work of the CPA in changing the face of the trade union movement, and based really around the fact that one of the most important elements of this is that the workers' struggle is an international one, and that workers from all around the world must unite if we are to defeat capitalism. I think that what the Migrant Workers Centre that I'm a part of now really relies heavily on the work of communists who were involved in the first iteration of the Trade Union Migrant Resource Centre down here in Melbourne. And the work that those comrades really did shape the movement, the face of the movement in Victoria, and particularly and around the country. We do see very strong representation amongst Greeks and Italians and Vietnamese, among others, in our movement. But the loss of that centre, and indeed the loss of the party and the work and its mass work and its continued organising in the 90s, I think has led to a slide, I think, in that representation, and where the movement has not found a way to bring in new cohorts of migrants that have come to this country in the same way that it did during the very active periods of the CPA. However, one thing that the Migrant Workers Centre is doing at the moment is doing a lot of work with the new cohort of Italian migrants who are coming looking for a new life in Melbourne and struggling against the very oppressive temporary visa systems that we have in Australia. People might not know, but 10% of the entire workforce in this country are made up of temporary visa holders or people that hold temporary visas, because there is very few pathways to permanency, which is one of the very large shifts in our migration system that creates a double precarity, not just workplace precarity, but precarity of residency. And one of the central parts of the work that the centre is doing is organising with migrant workers against this, this visa system to try and provide new ways for people to actually come and set up community and be more involved, not just in community, but also in our democracy, because there are currently as I said, more than 10% of the people as on temporary visas, many more on permanent residence who don't hold citizenship and don't have a full stake in our democracy. And it's no secret then, or it's no surprise then, that migrant worker issues are so marginalised against the interests of so many. I know we're keen to get into question and answer stage, but I do want to just again pay testament to the work of the CPA in its work, and particularly send best wishes to Joe Caputo, who is still involved in the trade in our Migrant Workers Centre on the committee. Which wish him the best, but also outline further, I guess, come back into Gaetano's point about the institutionalized racism. Again, we're seeing the White Australia policy creep back in a new form. Again, the CPA's stand on that was most steadfast againstly, but we now need to prosecute that case as the government starts to bring in new tests and new English language tests for spouse visas. So there's still a lot of work to do, and I think that there's a large, and it's never been more important to centre the voices of migrant workers and to organise in those communities collectively together to unite them across different ethnic backgrounds for one common good, which is well, to defeat neoliberal capitalism. So Serge, I might leave it there, but thanks everybody, and thanks to the other panelists.
Thank you, Matt, for that contribution, particularly bringing us up to date with the current campaigns that you're running and some of the issues that we're facing, particularly those issues to do with the temporary visas and the other questions, the more bread and butter issues that George was talking about, which are still heavily on your mind and in your work at the Migrant Workers Centre. I'll just go through some of the people that have been sending us messages so that the panellists can also share with those. I noticed that Pierina did make contact with Judy Mundy as she finished her last session, and that was touching to see that Judy and Pierina reconnecting after all these years. Simone Battiston has also sent his best wishes. I didn't credit Simone for his excellent work in the book that we're urging everybody to go out there and order through the New International Bookshop. Simone has written a biography of Pierina, and it's exceptionally good. And I took most of my introduction of her through that work. Thank you, Simone. Peter Murphy sends his regards, Pierina, from Sydney, and a long-time comrade of mine as well, of course. Frank Panucci sends his regards and also says, Pierina, we know it's 4:30 in the morning this morning in Modena, so you know you've done the hard yards in getting up at 4:30 this morning to participate in this session, and I'm really indebted to you for doing that. Lorella Di Pietro has said hello, and she's saying it from the Victorian Union and the PhilF in Melbourne. So thank you, Lorella. Adam Roris also sends his regards, and he's looking forward to hearing from us, especially from George Zangalis. So that's a great reconnection with comrades of the past, and they're very active at the moment. We've got a few minutes left. Would you, any of the participants, like to just comment on some of the comments that were made by Matt, you know, in respect mainly to the current issues and how we might want to tackle them from your perspectives? Maybe George, we can lead off with you.
Oh, that is the question. But one suggestion I'd like to make is to study a bit more of our short history. It is rather short history of mass immigration of 50 years and how things were done, not to repeat them in the same form, but to get the essence of it. Now, I did admit earlier that migrants come to this country with two basic skills missing. And they used to, not anymore, language and skills. Now, they do have a better understanding of English. It's become the international language. And Australian immigration policy requires people with skills. However, they still need people to do the shit work. Because there'll never be a society that doesn't need people who have manual skills, or if you like, the industrial proletariat. And migrant workers are not separate from their own communities. And my suggestion to many is we cannot advance the interest of migrant workers without at the same time making sure the communities they come from are part of the effort to achieve the ends. Because migrants do see in their communities their political field, their strength, and to the extent we relate to each other, the extent we're able to bring each other into the struggle and the campaign, to that extent we are successful. And we need to be speaking the workers' language. That's the most important thing. When J.J. Brown, the Secretary of the Railways Union, kept saying to me when I became an organizer, George, you ought to speak very simple, speak the workers' language. And I went down to Newport with him, and I said, Jack, the workers' language at Newport was basically Greek and Italian. He said, what are you talking about? I said, you try and talk to them in English and see how many understand you. Well, he did realize very soon that the workers' language today is multilingual. And we need to make sure that the communications use the workers' language, use the means we have in our disposal, thankfully, in radio and television, and newspapers, etc. So we need to cast a wider net to get better results, and also to ensure that the workers' organizations, the unions, the Trade Social Council, the ACTU, have on the table the matter of migrant workers. Don't leave it on the periphery. And that is the matter of pushing onto the political agenda.
Thank you, George. Pierina, would you like to say something about education, workers' education, and from your experiences in terms of activism today, perhaps?
You mean activism today in Italy?
Oh, even in Italy, what's the situation like in terms of what's happening in Italy with racism and migration, in the Italian sense?
In Italy, it's really a big issue, but it's not only an Italian issue, it's a European issue, because, in Italy, for instance, there is no channel for migrants to come regularly, So, and also in other countries, in other countries there are channels, but I think that migration is a structural thing, a structural problem, one side problem, but a fact, a global fact. And that the fact that people move, that capitalism is a global system, really, and that goods and capital move freely might be the case some duties, but that's nothing. From one country to the other, but people are supposed to stay where they are born. And that's a contradiction in logical terms, not only in humanitarian terms, but in logical terms. You can't pretend that people stay where they are born when capital investment moves everywhere as they want. So Italy and Europe are in that situation where their pulling up walls everywhere. They are externalizing borders in Libya, in Turkey. Also Greece in a certain way, although it's part of Europe, Italy in a certain sense, are seen as countries where to externalize the problem, the so-called problem. And we are living in this situation where, you know, the Mediterranean becomes the most, how do you say, lethal, place, you know, for migrants. And the mentality that when the crisis, the economic crisis, now with COVID, you know, becomes worse, people are uncertain about their future. The workers are losing their jobs, and all young people are precarious, have precarious jobs. Also, Italian young people move out of Italy and go to other countries in Europe. In that situation, it's easy to find scapegoats. And migrants have become, you know, for a number of years, have become a scapegoat. You know, that's the problem of migrants coming in. And, so it's not easy to move in this situation. You have to have an overall view of things and try to act to create unity among workers and also to find the right way to face the migration, the structural migration system. And I think we're still far from that in Italy, but not only in Italy, unfortunately. And education is one part of the question, but also, you know, acting on the overall situation, the overall problems is important. You know, seeing the things in a global way, where migration is a phenomenon which is incorporated in the overall situation, structural situation needs to do. I don't know, I might be not being, I'm being too generic, but that's the situation I want to, every one of us and who are doing something about it. You know, people who think it's a big problem and must be settled, but we have to have an overview, a global view to see how to face this problem everywhere.
Thank you, Pierina. Gaetano, we've got a couple of questions that have come in from Loretta. She's asking, she thanks us as the panelists for our wonderful contributions, and she's saying that the question about jobs for Australians and not visa holders has been the mantra of sections of the union movement. How do you shift this racist politics? Would you care to tackle that one, Gaetano?
Yeah, look, I'll try, Serge. Just a couple of points on that. I think that we have to look at migrant issues as labour issues, as work issues, and that visa issues are not just visa or immigration issues; they are work issues, because visas are used as a way of creating precarious work. What that means, therefore, is that, and look, we all know this, is that there's a migrant segregation of the workforce. Yeah, I sometimes look outside my window here in my home, and I see lots of delivery trucks. All the guys that pop out of delivery trucks are all guys from a certain Asian background. Right? That's the segregation of the workforce. When we talk about the women segregation of the workforce, I heard earlier today, for example, women generally are underpaid by about 14%. Migrants also, there's wage theft. Where wage theft occurs the most is with migrant workers. We just saw recently with the 7-Eleven, the underpayment, the wage theft that's occurred there. So I think, therefore, it's incumbent on the union movement, not, as Lorella mentions, is about jobs just for Australians and not visa holders, is to look at it from a broader perspective and actually to put pressure and influence on the government that the whole visa apparatus needs to be re-looked at from the respect of labour and from the respect of doing away with precarious employment, which segregates the workforce in Australia. And the ones that end up on the bottom are usually migrant workers.
Thanks, Gaetano. I've just unmuted myself, getting used to this technology. Look, I'm thanking the panel for their contributions, fantastic contributions from my point of view. I thank you for your time, and I thank everybody who's participated in the sessions out there. And I hope that somebody has got some, well, we've had some learnings out of this, particularly the last section of this one dealing with current issues. I suppose from my winding up comment is to say in Italian, la lotta continua, the struggle continues. So thank you very much, comrades.
Well said and well done, Serge. Thank you to all of you. Thank you for everyone for being part of the panel for that session. We're coming up to our last session now, and we've only got a short break, 15-minute break, to get in 15 minutes of music from the inimitable Bob Campbell. And so I'll put Bob on. Bob's former AMW organiser in the Newcastle area, and he's sent us this rather cool set of songs, Australian folk music, and I'll share that with the share screen. Thank you again, Matt, Pierina, Gaetano, and George, and of course you too, Serge. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Thank you.
Campbell.
Hi folks, my name's Bob Campbell. This is Jake Fay. We're going to play you a selection of my songs to suit the occasion. It's for all the comrades, past and present. It's a song for Davey Gilmore, one of the best known and loved Boilermaker shop stewards at Newcastle BHP. I made this song up after he told me about the loss of his use of his lungs after a life as a Boilermaker. Been 40 years in the steelworks since first I came out of my time. Been one of the best Boilermakers, be it welding or chalking a line. Seen industries rise from the river, and I've seen the black chimney stacks grow, while the other lot keep getting richer. My lungs are beginning to go. Been a long time a shop steward. My workmates I've always stood by, be it wages or working conditions. They all knew I'd give it a try. Now I'm looking out at the horizon. Hands are a fraction too slow. Soon I'll no longer gouge out the steel. My lungs are beginning to go. Of politics I never say too much. I always could tell wrong from right. I've been ready to stand at mass meetings and for principles ready to fight. Now the evening sun it is setting, night breeze beginning to blow. I look forward to a bit of fresh air in the chest. My lungs beginning to go. Here they go. Of politics I never say too much. I always could tell wrong from right. Been ready to stand up at mass meetings and for principles ready to fight. I'm looking out at the horizon, night breeze beginning to blow. I look forward to a bit of fresh air in the chest. My lungs will be beginning to go. Thank you, Davey Gilmore. We're surrounded by coal mines here where we are. I've been fighting all my life for socialism, and now I share a fence line with the Chinese Communist government, and I'm not a bit happy. This song is called Killer Black Coal. I lived in paradise, now I live in hell. Peabody coal mines chewing my hill. Poor old Yellowlands rolling down a hole, going down for profit and for killer black coal. Goodbye wombat, grey kangaroo, redneck wallaby, emu too. Wedge-tailed eagles flapping in despair, gotta eat somewhere, doesn't know where. Killer black coal mine growing everywhere. Killer black coal mine, does anybody care? Killer black coal trains coming round the bend. Killer black coal mines ripping out again. Singleton and Musselbrook, the kids are dying young. You can taste the lead and sulphur every time you move your tongue. Headlights, crash lights, the miners on the road. Big trucks rolling, lungs on overload. Killer black coal mine growing everywhere. Killer black coal mine, does anybody care? Killer black coal trains coming round the bend. Killer black coal trains ripping out again. Rip Shade, Cripple Creek, anybody care? We're all bound for mountains, where the valley's dead and bare. Said Shit Creek, Cripple Creek, does anybody care that the mountains are a moonscape, valley's dead and bare? Feel a black coal mine growing everywhere. Feel a black coal mine, does anybody care? Feel a black coal trains coming round the bend. Feel a black coal trains ripping out again. Black lung tears away the soul. Burn for 12 hours a day in this dirty, dirty hole. Shit Creek, Ripple Creek, we're all heading where mountains are a moonscape, valley's heading there. Black lung, breathing getting slow, dancing too long down that dirty, dirty hole. Feel a black coal mine going everywhere. Feel a black coal mine, does anybody care? Feel a black coal train coming round the bend. Feel a black coal train ripping out again. Shit Creek, Ripple Creek, does anybody care that the mountains are a moonscape, valley's getting bare? Said Shit Creek, Ripple Creek, we're all